Okay, and our next speaker this afternoon, is Dr. Jenica Allen. She's an affiliate assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire, and she'll be speaking to us about coordination opportunities and challenges for listing invasive plants in the United States.
Thanks, Carrie. Well, I have sleepy after lunch spot number 2, so thanks everybody for hanging in. So having this global perspective on proactive and reactive capacities actually leads really nicely into what I'm going to talk about today, which is looking within the US borders and asking some similar questions about state level regulations. And whether we have any opportunities or what the challenges are in dealing with the fact that invasive plants are shifting their ranges. In absence of climate change, they still are expanding into new places, but then also as they expand their ranges with climate change. And so I actually want to start by saying thank you to you, everybody in the room, because this idea actually was spurred by this meeting last year. So it's been sort of a very interesting and thought-provoking group to be a part of as a researcher thinking about what kinds of things might be useful from a management perspective. We've also had some institutional support and some support from NSF for this and related work. So I just want to put the way that I think about this invasive species and climate change problem into context. So after Monsi's talk, now I'm a little hesitant that this says negative impacts, but we know that invasives have sort of consequences when they enter new areas. Whether those changes are good or bad, maybe I should take my judgment off of that. But in general, we're concerned about these species because they do something to the places where they arrive. If we layer climate change on top of that, we can project shifts in species ranges, which then will bring the impacts of those invasive species to new geographic areas. And so in the context of climate change, that's one of the things that I think about a lot, are these impacts that are going to be new to a new geographic location. And so the question then becomes, does climate change actually provide an opportunity to contain invaders and their impacts? I'm actually a little bit refreshed that I'm not the first person to view some of this through the lens of opportunity today, because I do think that we often get a very sort of doom and gloom about this topic, and we need to sort of say, well, what can we do? And so this actually got me thinking about, well, what are the regulated invasive species lists? What are they? What do they do? What is their purpose? And so in general, they're in place to prohibit trade and the movement of listed species. And the general aim is to prevent new potential invaders and to limit the spread of ones that are already established. So this is not the first time you've seen a variant of this invasion curve today. But I would argue that these regulated lists are both trying to work on the prevention side of things. So on the left-hand side of our introduction point, so preventing those introductions, but then also on the EBRR and the containment. So trying to have this early warning system in place and mechanisms for that. But then if those fail or they're not in place once the species is widespread, then we can still contain some of those impacts by sort of constraining the species to places where it already is and preventing it from moving to new places. And so the way that I've been thinking about species range shifts are in the context of regulated species lists as an opportunity for containment. So here, if you've got a species current range in blue and the potential for its future expansion in that sort of orange color, I think there's some potential for coordinated responses to those potential range shifts, but really requires that we both, that different states, agree on which species constitute a risk and that they're on board with proactive regulation, that that's something that is, a useful tool for a given state. So this led to a number of questions for me. And I guess I should place the caveat right now. I am not a policy expert. I'm an ecologist. I think a lot about data and species distribution models. But these issues of what constitutes an invasive, how do different legislative processes work, is very relevant to those questions. So if there are folks in the room or online that are those policy experts that have an interest in this topic, please reach out to me, because I'm very interested in continuing this conversation with a diverse pool of input. But the first question we were asking here is how many different legislative processes actually exist for generating these regulated plant lists. Here I'm generalizing to invasive species, but we're looking specifically at plants. And are there regional patterns in those processes? Do nearby states do it the same way? Second was, how are those lists actually made? You know, what are the definitions? What is the content of the legislation that generates those lists? What species are on those lists? And what are the criteria for species to get on the list? And then finally is this proactivity question. Are there states that are regulating species proactively? Species that are not yet in the state, but that are already on the regulated species list? Since that's really what we're talking about if we're framing this in the context of climate change. And so the geographic and taxonomic scope is the lower 48 states and terrestrial plants, in part because that's my area of expertise, not because I don't think that aquatics or insects and pathogens aren't important. The legislation that governs those different taxonomic groups is not usually the same. So I'd love to extend what we've already done to those other groups as well, to see if there are similarities or differences between taxa as well. So digging into this first question, the legislative processes. Essentially what we did was we went out and pulled all of the legislation for each of the different states that pertained to invasive plants, to noxious weeds. They're called different things in different states. And we essentially, for every state, drew ourselves a flow diagram of what happens. And then once we had done that for 48 states, looked for commonalities in the process. And we've been able to collapse this down to really 3 main types of processes with 2 different subtypes. There's a very small difference between our subtypes. So type A is where you have some sort of agency, state government body created via legislation that creates a list. And that list is what is regulated. Type 2 is where there's some sort of state government list, but that what goes on the list is recommended, or an IPC, an invasive plant council, called different things in different states, but some sort of advisory board makes suggestions about what should be on that list. But there's one list that is published, and it's the regulated list. And then the third type is a very similar setup. And I should say these IPCs are created via legislation, where the IPC provides feedback about what should be regulated on the state list, but that there's also a secondary list that is published that is non-regulatory, that is not necessarily the same as the regulated list. And so this A subtype is the same thing, but then there's also some other non-legislatively created IPC that also publishes a list. This was more common than we anticipated, which is why, hey, we started out with 48 flow diagrams, we got it down to 6. I feel like we're doing pretty good. So, very similar setup, but just another layer of a list that's out there. And so if you've ever been confused about why are there so many lists, that's an excellent question that I don't have the answer to. But there's a lot of lists out there. And so if we map these different types, what we find is that about 45 or 46% of states fall in that type 2, where the IPC is providing feedback about what should be regulated. We've got about 23% that's type 3, which still gets that IPC feedback. So about 69% of states are getting regulatory recommendations from some body that sort of spans diverse interests. So they're typically industry representation, ecologists, land managers, that kind of thing on an IPC. We do see regional differences in terms of which type of regulatory process is most common. So in the Northeast, it's a pretty much even split between the type 2 and type 3, so 44% each in type 2 and type 3. So we've got a lot of IPC contribution in the Northeast to what those regulated lists look like. And so I see that as a pretty large opportunity here. So stepping into what are the characteristics of the lists themselves and how they're constructed, we asked the question whether there was just a definition that defined an invasive species or whether there was a specific protocol that must be followed in order to regulate a species. And then regardless of, which of those cases were true, what kinds of concerns were included in the definition or the criteria? Was it environment, economy, or human health? And so here's an example of a definition-based state. And so this is Georgia. So there's just a couple sentences about what constitutes an invasive species, but there's no specific set of criteria involved. This is the Massachusetts example, which we're going to hear about next, which has a very specific set of criteria, and a certain number or a certain level has to be reached in order to call the species invasive or likely invasive. And so the split is about 33 states were definition-based, about 15 states, or not about, 15 states were protocol-based. So the definition approach predominates when it comes to how an invasive species that is regulated is defined. So when it comes to what concerns were a part of that definition or protocol, economics actually rose to the top. So 42 out of the 48 states identified economic concerns as something that was important. 36 identified some sort of environmental concern. So we lumped lots of different things into these categories. And then 16 identified human health. So Brendan, you were mentioning before, we don't hear a lot about human health. That's actually reflected here too in terms of what gets included in these criteria. If we look at what species are actually on the list, so here the way you read this plot is if you've got clusters of states together, that means their lists are more similar to each other. And so they're coded by the census regions. What you should see is there's every color everywhere on the plot. So there aren't really any regional trends in terms of precisely which species make it on the list together. And I just highlighted Massachusetts here since that's where we are today. So even if there are similar processes, it doesn't mean that the same species end up on the list, which is interesting and potentially a hurdle if we're thinking about trying to coordinate things. And so this last bit about proactive regulation, here's a map of the number of regulated species. So there was an average of 51 species on the regulated species list across the country, median of 38. If we look at the proactive species, only about 7% of the species on any given list were listed proactively. And I say only, but 7% is more than zero. So there is some amount of sort of forward-looking thinking happening in the regulatory process already. So even though 7% doesn't sound like a lot, at least in some states, there is a framework in place to think about what might be coming versus what already is. So this proactive versus reactive. And I just want to point out that, in case it's not obvious from that bluish looking map, the southern and northeastern states do seem to list more proactively than the Midwestern states. We're all in the Northeast, so, good job. And here we're looking, simply to see if the number of species that are listed proactively, or the proportion of species on the list, was related to how many species were on the list in general, and really there's no relationship. So we don't have a good handle yet on why states list proactively, just that they do. and there's just a few states as an example. And so just to recap, we're sort of at the end of my time here, but where I see the opportunities and challenges from what we've looked at from a regulatory perspective so far. So while there is heterogeneity regionally in the listing processes, the fact that there's about 70% of states that get input from IPCs, I think is a potential, benefit for regional coordination. In that there are sort of multiple pieces of input coming into the regulated list. There's another benefit in that the regulated lists rely on both anthropogenic and environmental impacts, because that means we can use some of these established impact frameworks that we've heard about this morning to help us prioritize what species we might want to target for proactive regulation. And finally, the low level of proactive listing and sort of our inability at this point to understand why states are listing proactively is, on one hand, a challenge, but maybe we can flip it on its head and make it an opportunity to sort of open the door to the conversation about why should we be proactive, can we be proactive? And really bringing in a even broader audience than we have here, because there are commercial interests at play here. And I think it's important not to forget that. The ecological impacts are not the only ones that really need to be considered or do get considered when it comes to listing species from a regulatory perspective. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions. And like I said, please follow up via email if you've got interest or additional questions.